The Daily Bible in chronological order. Jesus teaches multitude. Matthew chapter 14, verse 14. Mark chapter 6, verse 34. Luke chapter 9, verse 11b. And John chapter 6, verses 2 through 4. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. He welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God, and healed those who needed healing. The Jewish Passover feast was near. 5,000 fed. Third Passover, April, AD 29. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 through 21. Mark chapter 6, verses 35 through 44. Luke chapter 9, verses 12 through 17. And John chapter 6, verses 5 through 14. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked us only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Kingship avoided. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 and 23a. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 46. John chapter 6, verses 15 through 17a. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus walks on water. Matthew chapter 14, verses 23b through 27. Mark chapter 6, verses 47 through 50. John chapter 6, verses 17b through 21. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waves grew rough. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the 4th watch of the night he went out to them, walking on the lake. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. He was about to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Peter walks on water. Matthew chapter 14, verses 28 through 33. Mark chapter 6, verses 51 and 52. On the Sea of Galilee. "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. Cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" When they had climbed into the boat, the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. Miracles at Gennesaret. Matthew chapter 14, verses 34 through 36. Mark chapter 6, verses 53 through 56. Plains of Gennesaret. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into the villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed.